absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to episode 305 of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's world-leading GPS watches and heart rate monitors. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes: interest editions, coaches' corners, learnings catch-up episodes, featured performers, and expert editions. Now, last week, we aired our top 10 most downloaded featured performers of 2021. And coming in as the most downloaded featured performer for 2021, we had current Olympic and World Triathlon Series champion and Ironman Triathlon world record holder, Christian Blumenfeld. Now, who will take the top gong as the most downloaded expert edition of 2021? Now, a refresher, back in 2020, it was Stacey Sims who was the most downloaded expert edition, when Stacey shared around female physiology and endurance training. So kicking off our top 10 most downloaded expert editions for 2021, we have Brenton Ford of Effortless Swimming, who featured on episode 277, sharing around optimizing your swim stroke and performance. Now, I asked Brenton an obvious question, and that is, what constitutes a good stroke? Here was Brenton's response, along with some great tips on how to improve body positioning for swimmers. A good stroke, we often hear that thrown around. They've got a nice stroke, an efficient stroke. It's a big open question. Answer it however you think's the simplest way to convey some learnings audibly. But what is and I guess we should specify, well, we're talking about freestyle here, given that so many of the listenership are triathletes and open water swimmers. So a freestyle stroke, what constitutes a good stroke? Maybe are there certain key things you immediately look for?
Yeah, there's a couple of key things, and this is keeping in mind that there's lots of different styles to freestyle. And a couple of things that we look at is obviously body position. Head, hips and heels should be at the surface, because the number one thing you can do to swim faster is reduce your drag. So body position is important, good head position. And I think that where people go wrong often is that often people either look too far down or they'll look too far forwards. So I know when I was taught, it was always about looking straight down, but a lot of people will bury their heads and they go too deep. So if you're swimming open water, you're probably best looking at about 45 degrees or somewhere in that sort of range. A good stroke will often be front quadrant. And what that means is that there'll always be something in front of the head. So a hand and arm always in front of the head. And that means that when you enter the water, you should be reaching forwards for a little bit before you start tipping the fingertips down and beginning the catch. So you're not just entering and pulling immediately through. There's that little bit of time spent reaching and extending. So front quadrant for most people is what we'd often want to see. And then a good catch is paramount. And that's one of the key things that we often focus on is a catch. And the catch is basically the movement from when you're fully reaching at the front to when your fingertips are tipping down just before you pass underneath your shoulder. So that's the catch. And to me, that's the 80-20 of the stroke. It's the 20% of the stroke that can really make 80% of the difference if you do a good job of that. Especially if you are a triathlete, you got a wetsuit on, you're probably not going to have to worry too much about your kick. The buoyancy is taken care of with the wetsuit. A good catch will overcome a lot of other flaws in the stroke.
A good catch. And just to clarify there, Brenton, the catch being the part out in front through to when the fingers are, did you say underneath the shoulder? Underneath the body?
Yeah, just about to pass underneath the shoulder. Yeah, so that first part of the underwater motion. Yeah, that's what we'd consider the catch.
And so just to reiterate there, Brenton, you mentioned body position, heads, hips and heels at the surface. So I think that's fairly easy to visualize. If you have your head too far down, then you're going to hit a lot more drag. And if you have it too far up, likewise, you shared that great tip. If you're an open water swimmer, maybe look, the ideal angle of looking forwards would be about 45 degrees. What would that be in the pool, Brenton?
Sometimes, usually similar. Or a little bit further down. So if you are looking straight down, there's nothing wrong with it, but you're going to have much better awareness around what's happening in the ocean or in the lake with that vision slightly forward. So the other way I'd explain that would be 1 or 2 meters in front of you in terms of where your eyes are looking. So instead of straight down, it's 1 or 2 meters in front of that is a good range, because then if you've got people in front, if you've got a buoy in the water somewhere, like you'll be able to see things a whole lot better than if you're looking straight down.
Yeah, so that's a great cue because it takes out the guesswork from the angle, right? 1 to 2 meters in front. Then you mentioned the front quadrant, making sure there's a hand or arm in front of the head. I think you said at all times. And then obviously the good catch. And you described the catch as the 80-20 rule there, 20% of the stroke, but it's got 80% of the difference. Now, if you happen to miss episode 277, heading into summer in the Southern Hemisphere at least, then do jump back for plenty of great learn-ins. Now, coming in as the 9th most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we heard from founder of the Queensland ADHD and Neurosciences Clinic, Dr. Asha Khan. It was a very popular expert edition. I asked Dr. Khan what the prevalence is of ADHD amongst athletes. Here was Dr. Khan's response, which yielded an insight into why some athletes, when injured, may have such a tough time psychologically. I mean, you look at people that achieve extraordinary things, you use the word outliers, and clearly everyone identifies a Michael Jordan and a Michael Phelps as history's arguably greatest outliers in sport. They have to see the world differently. They have to experience it differently. They have to think differently. And there's been some good documentary, like The Last Dance, I think it was called, with Michael Jordan, and I think everyone found that fascinating. But what you just shared, I think, is incredible. In order to battle the distraction that comes with ADHD, that individual learned to hyper-focus. Yeah. And surely that hyper-focus helps when it comes to highest level of performance in whatever the task. Academics, as you said, first line responders, sports. So what prevalence is there amongst athletes? I mean, there might not be any research around this, Asha, but would you look at high performing individuals in sport and often suspect that there's elements or diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD present?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is research. I was just looking at a paper this morning because of this interview, where I even found out that in elite athletes, studies have shown that the prevalence could be up to 18 to 20%. I was taken aback by this number because I've, been practicing in the 5 to 6% kind of a zone. So I think another study that I just found had an 8.1%, prevalence up to the age of 19 years in 17 studies. So it's very high kind of prevalences. And I also found that, but in my everyday clinical life, when I see my exercise-loving patients and sport patients, they're usually of that smarter group, and they are using hyper focus to pull through, to get through to life. Okay, so they're super productive, super sharp, but exercise is regulating them. Sports is regulating them. I see a lot of them. However, at the same time, when you look at studies, they come to me because, as per the science, they have the high level of stress, depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, that while they can block out the distractions during practice and competition with the hyper focus, nobody has actually measured and studied that hyper focus part. But that hyper focus, remember, when life changes and new battles come along, personal life and so on, that person who's been working so hard is going to struggle with the change. When you change this milieu that was sustaining them, when a job changes, relationship changes, they struggle. And that's when I see them at that crux in life where change or crisis has rattled them and ADD catches up with them. And this is where panic, anxiety, depression, and burnout, are the four most common symptoms that they experience. And in real life, it's almost always a social impact, relationships and social standing, finances, addiction, etc.
And if exercise is sustaining them, it makes me think of my work as a practicing physiotherapist, where an individual like this sustains an injury and, let's say, a bone stress injury, and they cannot run, and without the tools of your training, instinctively you know that individual's greatest struggle is not going to be the physical pain that they're enduring because of the injury. It's the psychological dysregulation, or whatever the term might be. They struggle, and you can't help but empathise with that being... Before I came to meet you today, there's a superbike champion who had a fairly nasty injury, and he's looking at probably a year or two of recovery, and he's sitting in the wheelchair in the room just with his legs pumping because he's just needing to move. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a long journey. So it really is a great example of how if the exercise is taken away from someone, they really do struggle. So if you missed episode 280 featuring Dr. Asher Khan, 2021's 9th most downloaded expert edition, jump back over with your pen and paper. Now, coming in as the 8th most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we have Professor Stuart Warden, who discussed the prevention of bone stress injuries in runners. It was little wonder that this episode has featured in our top 10 for 2021, with bone stress injuries being so prevalent amongst runners and endurance athletes. And one key takeaway was Professor Stuart Warden highlighting the importance of runners being mindful of their running intensity and the correlation that running intensity has with heightened risk of bone stress injuries.
The risk of a bone stress injury in terms of numbers of loading cycles. So you think about how many times someone hits the ground. It's predictable, basically to a one-to-one relationship. As your loading cycles go up, your risk goes up in the same proportion. Whereas when your magnitude goes up, it's actually more of a power relationship, or you can think of it exponential. As your magnitude of loading goes up, it's not a one-to-one risk ratio. Your risk goes up exponentially as your magnitude goes up. So you can tolerate increases in numbers of loading cycles pretty well. Bone's pretty well designed to be able to tolerate lots of loading cycles. But as that magnitude goes up, then your risk of bone stress injury increases more exponentially. So it is a combination of magnitude and load, but as you change your magnitude, that can push you over the hill more than increasing your actual, how many times you hit the ground.
And if I recall correctly, one of the statistics that you share, Stu, is somewhere around 10% increase in load magnitude of bone load can reduce or halve, I think, the fatigability or the threshold of fatigue in a bone from I think it might have been an animal study.
That is based on some modelling and some loading studies of bone, but it just goes back to the point that if you can reduce your magnitude of loading just a little bit, then you get a much larger decrease in your bone stress injury risk. Whereas if you decrease your mileage or your kilometres per week, you don't get the same sort of benefit as decreasing the magnitude of the loading. And that's what a lot of people don't realise is that, people will say, look, I'm doing, 100 kilometres, I'm doing 70 miles a week, and look at me, I'm doing this great mileage. But you've got to think about the intensity as well. If you're doing a lot of intensity work, then that can be often the thing that pushes you over the threshold to a bone stress injury, or really any type of musculoskeletal injury.
The golden question and magical solution would be how to progress runners' workloads so that they don't develop bone stress injuries, noting that magnitude or the intensity of the runs are so key in determining that. It's an algorithm, right? And your paper obviously gives some good guidelines, but it's still going to need to be a one-on-one individual approach.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's very personalized in terms of how you advise someone how they can exercise and how much they can do. And it's really working with that athlete. There's a number of aspects to it. And one is knowing what they've done in the past. knowing where they're coming from. And so do you have someone who's a novice who really hasn't done a lot in the past? Or if you've got someone who's, got some training background that you can go back to and work out what has that person been able to tolerate in the past? So you're trying to work out based on that individual, what can they tolerate? What sort of changes can they tolerate based on what they've been able to do in the past without getting injured? And so you're sort of getting this baseline of, okay, this is what we can sort of change by. The one thing, particularly for more novice runners who are maybe training for their first run, first half marathon or marathon, is making sure you give yourself enough time to build up that intensity and that workload. And the longer you give, then the safer you're going to be in terms of injury. So a lot of people don't make it to the start line of their first half marathon because they get, 8 weeks into a program and they break down. The longer you can give, the better it is. And you do want to increase the distance you're running progressively, but you've got to also think about the intensity as well and trying to find that balance between intensity and distance. You might have someone up to a certain mileage or kilometers, and that's what we try to do first is try to get someone up to a certain level of distance. Once they're up, because it's much safer to get the mileage than to get the intensity, what we've already talked about. So get them up to the desired mileage. Once you're up at that sort of distance per week, then you can start introducing your intensity work. But before you do that, you drop the mileage down just a little bit, right? So you drop it down a bit. Now you're starting to introduce some more intensity because you're increasing workload. You build up the mileage again at the new intensity up to that base mileage. Then as you increase the intensity again, drop down the mileage a little bit. So it's this sort of to and fro between, getting a certain workload in terms of distance and a workload in terms of intensity.
And I think a fatal flaw that so many athletes, including myself, so many times over the years make is we get excited and carried away and all of a sudden we're increasing the mileage and the intensity rather than pulling back on the mileage as we add intensity.
No, definitely. And that's what breaks down a lot of people and stops them from getting to start lines is increasing the intensity while they're also trying to build that mileage base. And so they're getting this double-edged sword that, they're increasing their mileage, so how many times they're loading the bone, but they're also increasing how hard they're loading the bone. You're changing too many things. And the bone then just says, no, thanks. That's enough. And we haven't really talked about what do we mean by intensity. When I'm saying intensity, that's really ultimately comes down to the speed of running, how fast you're going, how hard you're going. And we know that as you increase your speed, you're increasing the load magnitudes on the bone or the magnitudes that the bone is seeing. You've really got to, you build up that base. You can have some intensity sessions in there, but you don't want every session to be an intensity session because you end up overloading the bone.
So if you missed episode 281 or you are just looking for some great revision, jump back with Professor Stuart Warden, Preventing Bone Stress Injuries in Runners. Support for today's show comes from Polar. Polar have an incredible heritage. Headquartered in Finland, they have been the global driving force behind scientific wearables for over 40 years. They are the pioneers in and the world leaders in heart rate measurement technology. Their products provide you with 24/7 monitoring to enable you to plan better, train smarter, and recover fully. So as we approach a new calendar year, if you're feeling like you need to get back and beat your best, or it's time for a new GPS watch, head to polar.com to check out the incredible features like Polar Flow, Training Load Pro, run and bike tests, so you can nail your VO2 max and power training. And there's never been a better time to explore the world of Polar with the brand new military-grade Grid X Pro, the toughest watch out there, built from military-grade sapphire glass with ultra-long battery and new navigation tools. Or my favourite, the new Vantage V2, in stunning polar red, Polar's most formidable multi-sport watch to date. Now the team have offered up to 15% off selected products. Jump over to polar.com, use the code TPPS at checkout. Now let's continue the countdown. And coming in as the 7th most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we have New Zealand-based sports scientist Dr. Will O'Connor, who shared on episode 260 around how we can get started running with power meters and using the data that they provide. Just very fundamentally, how do people get started running with power? What do they actually need to do?
It's a good question. My recommendation is to get a stride power meter. So that's one that clips onto it's like a foot pod, and it clips onto your shoes, like your shoelaces. And so I would consider that kind of the gold standard of running power. That is their job. That company produces running power meters, and that's all they do. They also have a bit of an ecosystem platform which you can analyze the data. But you get that and you get it set up. Otherwise, Garmin has a heart rate strap, HRM Run, HRM Pro, HRM Tri, and you just need to download the app from the Connect IQ store. You're good to go to start running with power there. Coros has it inbuilt. Polar has it inbuilt. If you got a Coros, a Polar, or one of those heart rate straps with your Garmin, you're actually already set up to start using power. Now, what you kind of need to do, I guess, is just go out and start. If you're like, I want to get into power, so I had an athlete who's actually like, I'm going to do it after Total Wear Ultra, which is a big ultra marathon we just had here in New Zealand recently. I said, no, just start using power now. So we have that data, whether you understand it or not, as long as it's recording, we can go back and go, look, okay, well, I know you ran 100 Ks at this power and climbed at this rate or whatever. So just start, just figure out if your watch has got it or your device, get into it. And then the next step from there is doing a test to figure out your threshold. Kind of like any kind of threshold test. I like to use, I call it Dr. Will's 1 in 5 method, and that is a 1K all out and then a 5K all out. The reason I use distance, whereas if you buy a stride and read on other forums or blogs, whatever, they're going to say 3 and 9 minutes. If I asked you what your best 9-minute running speed is, could you tell me?
No.
Could you tell me if you're going to do a 5K tomorrow, what you'd aim at?
Definitely. And
a 1K, what you'd want to go?
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's why I use that. So it's a very clear cut measure that you're gonna be like, look, I want to get under 3 minutes. Yeah. And so I'm going to get a very good representation of your actual peak powers. Whereas if I say go for 3 minutes, you're like, geez, is that where am I for 9 minutes? Especially is that a 3K or is that, for, you set that and then you can use a calculator. I'd say jump on my website, drwilloconnor.com, and I've got Will's 1 in 5 calculator, and that'll just give you your critical power. And that is your threshold. Otherwise, if you're really gunning to get your threshold immediately, 10K, 30 minute, even, similar to on the bike, multiply by 0.95. If you've done a 5K and it's around 20 minutes, if you're one of the guns and you're doing 15 minutes, it's probably a little bit short and you want to multiply your power by 0.9, and that's going to give you a good representation of that threshold. I like to work off of percentages of threshold.
So just to recap there, we'll figure out if your device can do power. If not, look at potentially purchasing something like the Stride STRYD unit. As you say, it's sort of emerged as the gold standard device. Just start was your second tip, and then go figure out your threshold. And just to clarify, Will, 1 in 5, that was a 1K effort, maximal all-out effort. In amongst a 5K effort.
Oh, no, sorry. No, completely separate.
Okay.
Yeah. So you do your 1K, personal best effort, all out. Yep. And then a few days later, you do a 5K. Yeah,
all
sorry.
Out. Yep. All out. No, just to clarify, all out best effort. So you've got your two tests performed, then jump over, as you say, to something like your calculator, drwilloconnor.com, and there you can plug in your times and you'll get an output for your critical power. Your threshold. Yep. There were plenty of learnings in that one. Episode 260, Dr. Will O'Connor. Now, coming in as 2021's 6th most downloaded expert edition, we have US-based sports physical therapist and running coach Jason Torrey, who on episode 287 shared a bucket load of learnings for an episode themed Mastering the Middle Distance Runner. It's been a very popular episode amongst coaches, athletes and practitioners. And of course, when it comes to mastering the middle distance runner, the conversation would not be complete without exploring the role that strength and conditioning plays in mastering the middle distance runner. Specifically, Jason shared some wonderful insights around the periodization of strength and conditioning for the middle distance runner and why priority always needs to be given to the running workouts themselves. Can you share around phases that you tend to categorize for these middle distance athletes?
Yeah, so the periodization is obviously a very messy topic, and I think you have like the ideal situation versus the what you actually do. Oftentimes, the ideal or traditional model of that linear periodization thinking is like when you're in the off season, you're building general strength and work capacity. As you transition into preseason, working more on maximal strength and power, and then in season, trying to just maintain things as long as you can. That sounds nice theoretically, but for a lot of track and field athletes, they have more than one competition a year. And so there are multiple ebbs and flows of their season. They may not have a very long off season between, say, the indoor and outdoor seasons. So I tend to adapt more of like a block model where we're just working on pretty much anything that we need to improve various times a week and maybe changing it every couple of weeks. So an example of, say, working on somebody's gastroc soleus complex, we may still want to improve their work capacity or their strength endurance. We may also want to improve their maximal strength. So repping out between 4 and 6 repetitions of something until failure. And we may also want to be working on reactive strength. So something like single leg pogo jump. Those things might all appear in a span of 2 weeks, as opposed to just working on the maximal strength over the course of an off season and then progressing into those higher level power exercises as you get closer to the season. Because one of the main things that we have to remember about strength training is that this is a modality to help improve performance. So what we shouldn't be doing is prioritizing strength training over the key running sessions. If strength training gets in the way of those sessions, then there's going to be an issue. It really isn't about going in and having these legendary leg days and then coming out and having them ruin the track session the next day.
So that was Jason Torrey, our 6th most downloaded expert edition for 2021 from episode 287. Now, coming in as the 5th most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we have repeat guest of the Physical Performance Show, Professor Belinda Beck. On episode 293, Belinda continued our learnings around all things bone health when she shared insights about preventing bone stress injuries in adolescent athletes. A key theme emerged, and that is the importance for runners and endurance athletes in providing their bones and skeletons with a variety of loads. Here's Professor Belinda Beck explaining just that.
Isn't the skeleton incredible? If I have an image in my mind from a picture in a book that I read once that has a cross-section of a aeroplane wing and the way it has been engineered to be very, very light but very strong, and the arrangement of the trabecular struts in that wing, and then a cross-section of a vulture bone in their wing. And it's exactly the same. The body has adapted itself to be extremely strong but extremely light for these birds so they can fly easily. Our bones are the same. The reason they're hollow tubes, is because a hollow tube is much stronger than a solid tube that's not as wide. So that's why our bones are hollow. Why it makes more sense. So the problem with triathletes is that they often have been swimmers, competitive swimmers, and it's very beneficial to have a light skeleton as a swimmer. But also, if they train many, many hours and spend a lot of time in the pool, then that unloading of this daily weight-bearing stimulus is also not particularly beneficial. And study way back in the early 90s at Stanford showed this very clearly if they did a comparison between gymnasts, runners, cyclists and swimmers in their varsity team. So these are elite level varsity athletes. And they compared them to controls, inactive controls of the same age. And they found in terms of the bone mineral density, gymnasts were far and away the toughest and strongest bones. And after that, way, way lower down were the runners. The cyclists had bone mass of roughly the same as the controls, the inactive controls, because, of course, cyclists are in a weight-supported environment too, and the swimmers were lower than your average person, inactive person. So, again, there's this issue of self-selection. People with low bone mass are probably better swimmers, but also the fact that they were spending, 6 hours a day in the pool training is actually unloading their skeleton.
Gosh, it's and I know there's a great piece of work yourself and colleague Ben Weeks there at Griffith University and maybe some other collaborators have put out. It's the loading index of different sports. And I think that's what you're referring to there, Belinda.
Yeah, that's right. We developed the BPAC, which is the bone-specific physical activity questionnaire. And the purpose of that was because when people were trying to determine how much exercise they should do for their bones, they were using these physical activity questionnaires that were designed for aerobic and metabolic load. And we know that, marathon runners don't have particularly good bones. Incredibly fit, but that kind of instrument would show fitness, metabolic fitness, but it doesn't show bone fitness. So the bone-specific physical activity questionnaire has algorithms behind the scenes in the calculator we created that weights activities that load the skeleton heavily. And so we can detect or we can estimate how healthy somebody's bone is according to their BPAC score.
And that can be used by, it's more of a clinical academic tool as opposed to something that the public would engage with.
Yeah, well, it's free and, it's available, but it's definitely an academic tool because we don't have massive reference norms. We do have a paper that does have some reference values in there that people could refer to. It's not a very large scale one with, very broad population norms. So probably when I retire, maybe I can do that job.
So if you missed Professor Belinda Beck's episode 293, there's a bucket load of learnings there. Jump back with your pen and paper. Now, coming in as the fourth most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we have another return guest of the show, sports scientist and co-founder of Precision Hydration, Andy Blow. On episode 290, Andy helped us better understand how we can best fuel for training and racing around carbohydrate, and he explained the concept of our three levers. Andy helped us understand how we can best figure out and fuel appropriately for training and racing when it comes to our carbohydrate ingestion. And here's Andy doing just that. So the big question then, we know that carbohydrate intake is important. How do we learn our numbers?
I think what it comes down to is like we say with hydration, the fundamental learning mechanism is trial and error. But what you can learn from the science and from experience and from the kind of tools we're building, rather than having the ballpark for trial and error really wide, you can narrow down to a good starting point. And we know what that tends to be based with carbohydrate intake on two major variables, which are the length of the activity that you're doing and the intensity of the activity that you're doing. Basically, with shorter and or less intense events, the amount of carbohydrate you're going to need, because that's the fuel to power it, is going to be lower. And as the intensity goes up and as the distances and durations get longer, the amount of carbohydrate that you're going to need to support that work increases. And what it's all about is starting to figure out, okay, at the lower end, at what point does fueling need to begin? Does it need to kick in, and at what level? And then basically, how far do I need to go with that fueling as I go longer and harder races and get fitter? And how far can I go potentially in order to push the ceiling of performance up? The good thing about this is, unlike in the hydration science world, whilst it's not exactly uncontentious, there's a lot more agreement in sports science and nutrition around fueling numbers. And they sort of start at the lower end with around about 30 grams of carb per hour for activities that when you start to go beyond 60 to 90 minutes, then 30 grams of carbohydrate an hour is usually very tolerable by most people, is proven to support better performance, because at that point you're starting to burn through and get low on your endogenous glycogen stores. So the stored carbohydrate in your muscles and your liver is starting to get depleted. If you can supplement some of that, then you can sustain a higher level of performance. Once you start to go beyond 2 to 3 hours, you're going to benefit from more. And the standard recommendation, the starting point for most people's experimentation there is 60 grams an hour. So at that point, you really are going to rinse through your glycogen stores. So you're better off fueling a bit earlier, a bit more aggressively, and topping up further. And then what's been interesting in the last 10, 12 years is that this kind of 60 grams was always seen as a lot of carbohydrate. In the literature, at least, it was seen as a lot of carbohydrate to take an hour. Then people started studying athletes in the wild, and we're seeing guys and girls eating 80, 90, 100 grams of carbohydrate an hour. And so science kind of had to do a bit of catching up, reworking its thinking. And now what we're seeing is lots of anecdotal reports and some case studies of people eating 120. I've even seen 140 grams of carbohydrate an hour in some circumstances for very fit athletes doing very long, very hard events. And so that at least gives us that kind of 30 to, let's say, 120 grams of carb an hour, gives us a really good range for where to start experimentation based on your past experience and the sort of the duration and intensity of your event.
So 30 grams or 60 grams is a base sort of starting point, as you say, Andy, dependent on the intensity of the event and also the duration. With higher intensities, I've read greater than 60% of VO2, so those upper level efforts needing carbohydrate, and less than that, less so.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because when you're going, I mean, that's the thing about the carb discussion, is often what gets glossed over is, this isn't just about, you could go out for an easy 3 hour bike ride. And if you went easy enough, you're going to be burning majority fat, and you may not need to supplement with very much carbohydrate at all. I mean, you may choose to if you've got another training session later that day or the next day or whatever. But when we talk about these recommendation numbers, these are about optimum performance at a high output. So it doesn't mean every time you go out the door and do something for 90 minutes, you need to be slamming energy gels. I think that's definitely the wrong message to be putting across. This is about selected times when you're pushing your limits. So the harder training sessions, and obviously racing when you're really trying to empty the tanks.
Andy, I know that Precision Hydration has been a supplier for, I believe, several of the Tour de France teams.
We're an official partner for Team DSM. So they use our sweat testing technology and some of our products in the Tour. And we also unofficially, because it's the way it works in pro sport, a lot of other teams have partners and sponsors, but a lot of individual riders or some teams will also use our products, even if they're drinking them out of different bottles.
Always popular, always informative. That was Andy Blow, episode 290. You're listening to our top 10 countdown for 2021's most downloaded expert editions. Support for today's show comes from AMP Human and Momentous, building the future of human performance. AMP Human are the creators of PR Lotion, a lotion used by some of the planet's best endurance athletes and sporting teams. PR Lotion is designed to maximize your training and recovery by unlocking bicarb, a natural electrolyte that improves muscle function and helps you combat fatigue during hard workouts. Train, compete, and repeat with AMP Human PR Lotion. Now, the AMP Human team have generously offered a saving of 25% when you buy from the AMP Human brand store over at bikeexchange.com. Simply use the code TPPS25 at checkout. That's TPPS25 at checkout. Get your hands on PR Lotion, train, compete, repeat. Support for today's show also comes from Precision Hydration. I caught up recently with Andy Blow, who we just heard from as one of our top 10 most downloaded experts, and Andy outlined what Precision Hydration has been up to.
Yeah, Brad, it's been a great project this last year because what athletes want to know is how much fluid, how much sodium, how much carbohydrate they need to take in per hour. And we know from all the studies we've done, we know from all the scientific evidence out there that those numbers are quite varied between individuals. So what we've been working hard to do is pull together a bunch of case studies for athletes across a range of endurance sports, triathlon, running, cycling, swimming, to see how much fluid, how much sodium, how much carbohydrate are people taking in per hour, and then how successful they've been in their events. And the idea with these case studies isn't that they're up there for people to copy, but they're to get your head around the numbers that might work for you and to give you a platform to build on. And then in conjunction with the tools that we've got on the website, like the online sweat test, the quick carb calculator, you can dive in and use those tools to get your numbers sorted out and start that trial and error process to see how much fluid, how much sodium, how much carb is going to work for you when you're out there competing in the summer heat.
Now, the Precision Hydration team have generously offered 15% off your first electrolyte order or any of the products from their brand new fuel range by simply using the code TPPS at checkout over at precisionhydration.com, and do take the online sweat test and use the quick carb calculator. For now, let's jump back with our top 10 most downloaded expert editions for 2021, and we are now into the podium positions. Now, coming in as the third most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we have recently released Expert Edition featuring Triathlon Norway's head sports scientist and elite coach Olav Alexander Boo. Now, Olav shared openly around some of the sports science that he has implemented to help the Norwegian triathlon team become the most dominant team on the planet when it comes to triathlon across all distances. They took the gold medal in the Tokyo 2021 Olympic Games. Christian Blumenfeld also captured the World Triathlon Series in 2021 and set the Ironman Triathlon World Record in Cozumel, Mexico in a blistering 7:21:12. And even in the short time frame since episode release, this episode has garnered so much attention, and is there little wonder why. The Triathlon Norway's sports science approach is second to none. One of the key themes that emerged from Olav's sharings was that endurance athletes must get their fueling dialed in order to optimize performance. And here's Olav sharing around that key theme.
Very often what happens in sports is that people try to lose weight, for example. So maybe losing weight to improve their watts per kilogram ratio or something like this. The problem is that one of the things that we do see is that losing weight doesn't bring necessarily up your VO2 max. So if you look at VO2 per kilogram, you can maybe, depending of course a little bit where you are and so on, if you have a lot of excess fats on your body and so on. But normally what we do see is that if you're reducing your kilograms too much, we also see that actually your VO2 max actually ends up going down. So in Christian, even in Norway, where we have very conservative guidelines for when it comes to, I'll say, losing weight or so on. Even when Christian goes down towards 72, 73 kilograms, his absolute VO2 max, so measured just in milliliters per minute, actually goes down. So if he goes down, so actually he's more powerful in terms of VO2 with more weight on his body as well. And that's not only muscles, that's actually also a little bit extra fat on his body. 100% the reason for why we have been speculating and why we don't know 100% why. But you can imagine now that if you look away from that and you only quantify this as watts per kilogram, that would mean, in his sense, that as long as he was able to maintain, let's say, that target power that you are gauging your watts per kilograms again. So let's say it was your 20-minute power or something like this. From that perspective, he might be able to maintain the same power output for those 20 minutes. But from a watts per kilogram perspective, it looks better now because he has a lower weight. But because we know that his VO2 goes down, it basically means that he needs to to fill that gap, to hold the same power with more glycogen instead. So I think, energy availability and how to say, of course, you don't want to gain too much weight and all these kind of things, obviously. But I think that maybe there's a lot of people that could have gained some speed actually in the end by reducing the focus on how to say food, because the body is smart. If you start to restrict the food that you get into your body, so the calories you go into the body, well, those calories is basically what you're going to turn into power. And if you are restricting that, well, what happens short term, maybe it's not so obvious, but maybe it becomes more obvious in the long term, and a lot of people struggle from that. So energy availability and having a program that where we how to say almost make the program based on calories, so that so that not only the ceiling of VO2 max, but also how to say the ability to burn a lot of calories during a week is important.
Olav, if you could give age group aspiring Ironman athletes looking to perform at their best across an Ironman distance, say a top tip around what you just shared there, what would, if they could do one thing, obviously their resources, they don't have access to testing and the close monitoring at times or mostly, what would be your top tip on how they could optimize their, like you just shared, their energy availability and get the most out of their training?
I think first thing would be that what you're trying to do in training is, of course, to perform. You want to perform in your training, so create a stimulus, and hopefully you'll progress that stimulus, so you can go either a little bit longer or a little bit higher on the key sessions over a month. That means also for those sessions you need to fuel properly in front of it. You can't. I have a very hard time giving a general advice, at least, because maybe there would be specific cases, but like a general advice, I would always say that it's better to overfuel a little bit than underfuel leading into a session and also during the session, because if you have an energy deficit, it will also be very difficult to make a progress or progress in your training.
To adapt from that training stimulus.
Yeah, not only adapt, but actually also even perform during training.
So if you missed Olav Alexander Boo, jump back to episode 304. And coming in as the second most downloaded expert edition for 2021, we have UK-based specialist musculoskeletal physiotherapist, researcher and lecturer, Dr. Bradley Neal, who on episode 296 shared around patellofemoral pain, that is kneecap pain, best practices. Now, kneecap pain can be one of the most pesky and common of injuries that a runner or endurance athlete may be challenged by. And during the episode, Dr. Brad Neal shared the following tips specifically for the runner with patellofemoral pain. What tips would you suggest could be effective for the running cohort out there?
I don't necessarily feel as though runners need to be treated drastically differently to a typical patient with patellofemoral pain. I think the rough way I would go about it clinically is that if someone demonstrates significant motor weakness, then I typically go there first. And you know, there's a growing understanding of the role of strength and conditioning for performance from a running perspective. So more and more endurance runners are being comfortable with getting in the gym and doing something other than running, which isn't a bad thing. And if someone comes in demonstrating quad weakness, hip weakness, the stuff we talked about, then that's a good place to start. I still think there's benefit of a gait analysis, but from a relatively simple metric, you know, so a sagittal plane view, so looking from the side on and looking purely at stride length. You know, if we lean on some of Chris Napier and Chris Brammer's work on overstride and braking force and some of the work we've done on adduction, female runners, and then Rich Willey and Irene Davies and Brian Noren's work on gait retraining, cadence retraining. If a runner's demonstrating a significant overstride, if they're landing with a foot well ahead of their knee joint rather than the foot planting nicely underneath the center of mass, I think there's a role there for some manipulation of cadence, definitely. But in the same as all of these other interventions, to see if it changes the severity of their symptoms. I would be hesitant to say that run retraining has got the ability to prevent PFP because those data aren't there. And there's the continued argument of once someone's symptoms have settled, can they go back to their old gait or do they want to stay where they are? I answer that question in a similar way to the orthoses question, really, is that you don't see elite runners overstriding. And when you do some cadence manipulation with a runner, you often, once there's that initial washout period, you often make them more efficient because you optimize their stride length and cadence. So most of them don't want to go back because it feels quite alien because you've made them more efficient. So I think there's a definite role for a simplistic gait analysis to look purely at stride length and cadence and sagittal plane variables. I think the other thing that would ring true would be the orthoses argument, and it may not be a definite introduction of orthoses, but it could potentially be a manipulation of footwear. Again, I think some runners could probably run in the box and get away with running in whatever they want. Some people are probably more shoe sensitive than others, and involving someone with good knowledge around running shoes or a sports podiatrist would be a good place to start.
So that was Dr. Bradley Neal taking out the silver medal, if you like, for the second most downloaded expert edition for 2021. And now, a drum roll, 2021's most downloaded expert edition, looking into an area that is bestowed with so much mythology, was repeat guest of the Physical Performance Show, Associate Professor Max Paquette, US-based physical therapist. Now, on episode 294, Max shared the science around running surface interactions, and he tackled the age-old thinking and notion that running on softer surfaces must be better when it comes to reducing running-related injuries. Turns out that isn't necessarily the case, and here's Max outlining why that is.
So I think the myth is always that soft surfaces are better than hard surfaces. And again, it goes back to the initial question that you posed. And I think that's also a very broad statement that soft surfaces are better than hard surfaces. And I think the low-hanging fruit there is talking about how demands change depending on surface type. So this might be oversimplified, but I think it's probably the best statement to make when we discuss surfaces with regards to tissue demands. We'll go to two extremes. So sand, running on sand, which is arguably the softest. And again, soft also is might be a bit of an ambiguous term here, but soft in the sense that you're going to get nothing out of the ground, right? So when you run on sand, you push down, the sand doesn't really push back at all on you because it dissipates. Of course, it depends on if the sand is wet, if you're on the beach, right? So again, broad. If the sand is packed down, you're running on the Gold Coast, for example, and you have a nice, flat, packed down, wet sand, you're going to be running as if you're running on a dirt path, for example. But if you're running on a sort of non-wet sand, it just completely dissipates below your feet, and so there's no response from the ground. So you're pushing down, but you get nothing out of it. Whereas if you go to the opposite extreme, which is pavement or concrete, whenever you're pushing into the ground with your foot to propel yourself forward, the ground is highly responsive because it doesn't actually deform. Right? It's a very rigid surface, so it pushes back pretty much immediately on you. All right. So here the assumption is that, if you're running on a really soft surface and I'll say that we're trying to maintain the same speed, which remind me to get back to that because that's likely not the case, right? So assuming you're running at the same speed on sand and pavement, the idea is that when you push off the sand, it doesn't respond back. And so your muscles have to work a little harder, do a little bit more work. So sort of applying force over greater displacements because you're not getting anything from the ground, right? So think of it from a calf standpoint. So plantar flexion you might plantar flex more as you push off to try to get the most out of that propulsion. So your calf muscles are shortening more, and they're producing force, and so they're doing more mechanical work, and that's costly, of course, which is also why running on sand is very difficult. So in this case, you could argue that running on a really soft surface is really hard on the muscles, and as a result, on the tendons that are attached to those muscles. The tendons are being pulled on for over longer displacements. All right. Now, I don't know of any studies who have assessed tendon characteristics on sand, for example, and so on, because it's very difficult without force plates under the sand. You can't really measure things as you would in a lab. So it's more speculative, but makes theoretical sense anyway. Over ground, and same thing applies when you strike the ground in the sand, right? When you strike the ground, the force that you're applying to the ground essentially dissipates. So likely there's not as much getting back to you. So potentially from a reducing the amount of forces applied to your body at touchdown, it's likely a little bit less. We might say that, as a general term, that running on a soft surface like sand or really fluffy grass or dirt, if you will, might lead to less force applied to the body, which might be good from an impact standpoint in terms of lower impacts, but it's not great in terms of propulsion, because to propel yourself, you have to have something to push off of. And so then the opposite is true to running over a hard surface. When you hit the ground on a hard surface, it doesn't move under your foot. So all the force that you put into it goes back to you, right? So that's the impact. We'll say impact forces here, for lack of a better term. And then when you propel yourself, same thing, you get everything you put into the ground. So a lot easier on the muscles, right? In a way. So less work having to be done by muscles, arguably why it's a little bit easier to run on pavement than it is to run on sand. Someone might summarize this by saying, when you run on a soft surface, your muscles are doing more work. It's more demanding on muscles and tendons and more metabolically demanding. When you run over ground, though, even though you get a lot of, you're able to push off a lot easier on the ground, there's fewer forces, or the demands on muscles are less. So as a result, it might not be as taxing on muscles and tendons to run on hard surfaces. But then because of the greater impacts when you hit the ground, that might be bad from a bone loading standpoint. So soft surfaces, potentially bad for muscles and tendons. Hard surfaces, potentially bad for the skeletal system.
A massive congratulations and thank you for your contribution, Associate Professor Max Paquette. If you happen to miss episode 294, you must go back with your pen and paper and get ready for the learn-ins. So there you have it, 2021's top 10 most downloaded expert editions. Congratulations to the place getters, but of course a huge thank you to all of our expert edition contributors through 2021. Of course, we have a little bit of fun with this episode, but as I know you are, so appreciative of the contribution that all of our guests make. If you've enjoyed today's episode, consider sharing it with one of your training buddies. It's a great way of exposing them to the inspiration and information that we try and provide you. Thank you in advance. Of course, thank you to the team who have made this show possible throughout this calendar year. Daryl Misson, audio engineer, Susan Wilkin, show administration, and Matthew Walding, show graphic design. It's been an enormous year. The show has continued to grow significantly, reaching new countries and earbuds worldwide. The show has now been enjoyed in over 210 countries around the world. And in this calendar year, the show has enjoyed more than 500,000, that's 500,000 downloads. So thank you for tuning in and your support. Big thank you also to our show patrons. If you would like to support production of the show, you can practically do so by becoming a Learn-Ins member. It's simple, jump over to Patreon, search for the Physical Performance Show, and there from just $5 per month, you can practically help support the show. Of course, in return, we'll grant you complimentary access to our back catalogue and all upcoming live stream events, normally ticketed at $49 per person. They are full of learn-ins. Now, to wrap up the year, please take a podsy of this episode and share it on your socials. Tag in the show at Physical Performance Show and we will repost all of those. Let's have some fun with it. thank you for tuning in this calendar year 2021. And as we turn the page and enter a new year 2022, throughout January, we're going to have some fun with a summer series. Now, we are well aware that half of our listenership is in the Northern Hemisphere, but from the physical performance show's Headquarters, it's summertime. So over the weeks of January, you can enjoy some punchy episodes as part of our summer series, exploring key learnings around injury prevention and management, fueling, psychology, and physiology. So until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.